This episode is part of a pod course offered by SpeechTherapyPD.com for ASHA registered continuing education credit. Visit SpeechTherapyPD.com for more information about how listening to this podcast can help you earn credits.
Hi folks, and welcome to First Bite, Fed, Fun, and Functional. I'm your host on this nerd venture, Michelle Dawson, MSCCC SLP, the All Things Peds SLP. This podcast was, like most creative processes, birthed from a combination of several cups of coffees and, honestly, even more questions posed by a series of impassioned graduate students that I've had the pleasure of supervising over the last several years. First Bite's mission? It's to answer those questions that we've all had, but we've either been too afraid to ask or we didn't have the subject matter expert saved to our own personal speed dials. So, do you too have more questions and answers when it comes to treating your medically complex and fragile pediatric patients? Are you unsure if the signs and symptoms that you're observing are indicative of an allergy, maybe an underlying GI issues, or could they possibly be neurologically driven? How many questions do you really have for that registered dietitian regarding the formulas prescribed and the flow rate through that patient's G-tube? Have you ever been consulted for a quote-unquote difficult latch only to find out that the mother's exclusively breastfeeding, but you've never nursed a little one or worked with the breastfed patient before? And what about functional communication? Are you so over flashcards, but you need advice on how to get started with core vocabulary with a non-speech generating device, or how to find the right fit for a speech generating device? Do you have additional worries about the basic day-to-day running and documentation of your private practice? How do you go about obtaining referrals or even documenting that note so that the insurance company deems it medically necessary? If you answered yes, well, then come join me, Michelle Dawson, for this dynamic podcast presented by SpeechTherapyPD.com. Who am I, you ask? Well, I'm a self-described SLP geek with, as my family says, a touch of the ADD and ADHD. I have a passion for serving the least of these, namely the most complex and involved pediatric patients in their natural environment through my private practice, Heartwood Speech Therapy, in the Columbia, South Carolina metro area. I also have had the pleasure, and currently still am, traveling the country where I lecture on best practices for pediatric dysphagia and functional language acquisition delivered through an early intervention natural environment model. Are you still intrigued? Then come join me as I interview some amazing folks. And don't forget that you can submit questions for a Q&A or interview request topics to me via email at firstbite@speechtherapypd.com or on our Facebook page. And also check out our website. Drop a review. Subscribe to obtain those coveted ASHA CEUs. All right, folks, let's get right to it. Welcome back to First Bite, Fed, Fun, and Functional Resources for the Pediatric Clinician. I'm your host, Michelle Dawson, the All Things Peds SLP. The topic of today falls in the Fed category. You can't see it, folks, but I'm air quoting it there, the Fed category. And this is one that has been literally a year in the making. So needless to say, I am geeking out excited to let y'all know that Mr. Jeremy Pons, licensed dietitian nutritionist from Columbia, South Carolina, and super daddy extraordinaire to a whole group of girls, will be our guest speaker today. I first met Jeremy a few years ago when we were working together at Newberry County Memorial Hospital, and we would run and trip over each other trying to get into these super teeny tiny dictation rooms there. And our paths overlapped I think a year or 2 years later when we were both consulting at a private practice, and he was making dietary recommendations for the pediatric patients that had severe feeding aversions that I was treating on that side. After several conversations, and trust me, this is embarrassing and humbling to admit, I realized I don't really have a clue what a registered dietitian does. And I don't have a clue about the different formulas that our patients are taking, much less what those formulas were doing to the patient's bodies, overall health, and helping them reach their developmental goals. It was definitely not covered in my dysphagia class that I took a million years ago. If you're a unicorn and it was covered in your dysphagia class, then don't ruin it for the rest of us. All right. So after a series of Facebook Messenger phone tag, we finally, stars align, we pegged down the date, and we today get to hang out and geek out on all things formulas. So, Mr. Jeremy, how is that for a very honest intro?
That's awesome, Michelle. Thank you so much for having me. Yeah, I'm excited to be here. Excited to talk about all the crazy, nutty world of nutrition and the weird little details that we think about that no one even knows what we're talking about. So this should be fun.
Awesome. Yes, because once the registered dietitian starts going really technical, all of us kind of glaze over and we smile and
Yeah,
nod.
yeah. We're talking about flow rates and calculations, and people are like, what is going on exactly in your head?" So
Yeah, I it makes me think of the penguins from Madagascar. Wave and nod, boys. Wave and nod.
that's right.
All right. So, all right. So, talk to me a little bit about you. Where did you study? Talk to me about your practice and enlighten us to how you got to here.
Yeah, awesome. I attended Winthrop University in Rock Hill, South Carolina, for both my undergrad and master's. So I got my undergrad in nutrition and dietetics there, and then finished my master's there a few years later, and came straight from there into the clinical world. So I went and did my clinicals at Palmetto Health Richland in Columbia, and from there I actually worked with them on the inpatient side for about 6 years. Went by really fast. And in that world, that's kind of where I first connected and got involved with pediatrics. I saw a lot of adults there, but because of my position, I actually had a floating position that put me in basically every single spot that there was, which was really good. Got a lot of well-rounded expertise, but I also got to work with the talented people and both the NICU, which put a whole new world, exposure to me, as well as working with Kelly Lewis, the pediatric dietitian at the Children's Hospital. And so that sort of introduced me to the world of peds. And then later, I moved over and began doing their outpatient counseling there, and did that for a couple of years. Then started into private practice, and I've been doing that ever since. So I've been doing private practice along with some contract work, like you said, where we met at Newberry Hospital. So still working with that population some. And then in my private practice, I work with both adults and peds, but working a lot with people with food allergies and intolerances and gut issues, and in the process of getting my functional nutrition certification in that area. And I'm super excited about that because it's really opening up my world and kind of giving me a better picture and a more in-depth picture to help the really sick people. So that's what I do. It's a lot of fun, and there's never a dull moment.
And what's if folks have questions after we get done and they want to reach out and talk to you, what is the name of your private practice? Do you have a website, Facebook page?
Yeah, it's Path of Life Nutrition. It's in Lexington, South Carolina, and my website is www.pathoflifenutrition.com. And you can also search the same name on Facebook, so you can find me there. And yeah, I'd love to connect with any folks who want to reach out and kind of see what I do.
Okay. Fantastic. Thank you. I'm going to give you a shameless plug because you're Mr. Humble Pie and wouldn't do it, but I know people are going to have questions. So there it is. All right. Okay. So I'm so excited. I'm just like ready. Let's go. All right. So talk to me. All right. I go do my swallow eval, and the mom's telling me, oh, well, we're doing 3 cc's or 30 cc's of Peptamen Junior. And I'm like, okay, can we put that one in ounces because I don't need other.
Right?
And
That'd be nice, wouldn't it?
yeah, I'm like, okay, I speak in ounces. And then talk to me. All right, so Peptamen Junior. Okay. And then I just smile and nod, smile and nod. And I'm
Right.
worried about, are they aspirating? Do they, have any, premature leakage? Like how much are we actually consuming? What are we wet vocal quality? I'm looking at those mechanics, I forget that I should also be considering what's in that bottle. Um, can you talk to me about what are the different formulas that are out there? Because we're like blank slates.
Sure. Awesome. Yes. No, be happy to. So basically, when it comes to formulas, you're going to see them split into three main categories. You're going to, and they're, and it, the categories are divided based on protein structure because that's kind of the initial question we ask. And that's simply because when you're introducing food into a digestive tract, you need to know what condition their digestive tract is in. And depending on the child, it's going to be better or worse. They may have metabolic issues, they may have intolerances, they may have enzyme problems, and all of those equate to being able to tolerate some formulas better than others. And so when we ask our first question, when we're establishing what sort of formula you're going to have, we're looking at, okay, what is the protein structure that this child can tolerate? And that basically gets broken into three areas, either an intact protein, which essentially means a protein that has not been disturbed. So you're going to see something that maybe is a more than likely a milk protein base of some type. It'll either say milk protein concentrate or milk protein isolate or something along those lines, sodium caseinate, whatever it may be. And we consider that an intact protein, and that's kind of your standard base. That's what you're going to see the majority of people on that are on, these types of formulas. And examples of that, would be things like Nutrin Junior or Boost Kid Essentials 1.5. Like those are examples of what an intact formula would be. Or if you're looking at infants, just your normal infant formulas like Similac or Enfamil, Pediasure.
Okay. Can after I breastfed, I'm a huge fan of feed the babies at the boobie if we can.
Yep.
But let me tell you what, when that, and I know you're dad, so you get it. But when that first one grew teeth, I was like, and I'm out. Mom's done.
Oh yeah,
So,
I've been there, done that 4 times. Yeah.
Yep. So mom's done. We moved over to Earth's Best organic formula. Is that
Yep.
an example of like an intact formula?
It is. It is. So that's an example of an organic, intact cow milk based formula.
Yeah.
So most if you're looking at infant side on your intact level, you're going to see some that are cow's milk based, goat milk based, human milk based, or soy based. Those kind of your 4 different areas for infant formulas. And in that spectrum, then most of those are also going to be intact formulas. So Earth's Best is an example. Like I said, Similac or Enfamil is an example. Enfagrow, Pure Bliss is one that I believe Abbott has come out with recently. That is an organic, non-GMO version of a normal infant formula that, again, is an intact cow milk protein. So by and large, most people are going to start there, and that's kind of where you want to stay unless there's a problem. And that's really how we usually start out. And so when you talk to, when I talk to parents, that's one of the things I'll ask in their history is, okay, what's the progression of all the formulas you tried? Because if I see them on something like, NeoSure or Nutramigen, I'm thinking, okay, they definitely have a GI history, and I need to see what the progression is and why they ended up way down the line on a formula that's really specialized. And so you start with an intact protein. If that's not working, then more often than not, either they may switch to something like a sensitive, which our kids did when they needed formula. They did like a Similac sensitive or pro sensitive, or I think the one we did was Nestle, a Nestle like Gentle Ease or something.
Yep.
Anyway, it ended up being much better tolerated simply because the protein was partially broken down. And so the next step you go to is what we call a hydrolyzed or a peptide-based formula. And that's where the protein is not completely broken down, but it's broken down into what we call peptides, where the proteins are in smaller pieces. And then that allows a baby or a child to take it in with less digestive problems and less issues. And so if there's an enzyme problem, or they're having a lot of colic, or constipation or whatever, that's going to be the next step we go to. And so you'll see things like Similac Alimentum, Pediasure Peptide, your Peptamen Junior. That's an example of one of those. and Nutramigen. Those are all these sort of hydrolyzed formulas that basically allow a child to use that easier. And then in the case where those still aren't working, and that's in the child usually that has like a true food allergy, maybe a dairy allergy, maybe a soy allergy, maybe something along the lines of just, something in that formula that they cannot tolerate, that's when we take them all the way down to what we call an elemental formula. And an
Okay.
elemental formula is basically where there is no resemblance to any whole food in that formula that they can react to. So the proteins are completely broken down into amino acids. It's just pure amino acids. And those amino acids then allow you to assimilate and take in that formula with minimal effort, minimal work, and minimal reactions. And so with people who are having tremendous problems like eosinophilic esophagitis,
EOE. Sorry, translate that
EOE,
fast.
that's right, EOE, and issues where they're having tons of reflux that's due to food allergies, or they have metabolic or DNA abnormalities. Then these elemental formulas like NeoSure, Elecare, Vivanex, Neocate Junior, those are what we use as sort of that last step. And 99.9% of the time, they work great. They just taste terrible. So you don't ever want to have to drink them, but in a tube feed, they work great.
Okay. Now I actually have had the pleasure of working with a couple kiddos that had EOE.
Yes.
And one of them, he got put on Elecare Junior, but vanilla flavored because he didn't need a feeding tube. He was able to transfer. Well, I mean, he had a feeding tube, but structurally his swallow was sound. So once the esophagus healed and he had 8 weeks of like esophageal rest, then
Yep.
we produced. So adding that vanilla, does that make it more complex, or is it just
it helps the flavor. It's probably still not great. It doesn't really affect the nutrition, thankfully. But yeah, I mean they try to disguise it when they can. That's a good try. It's just that when you're taking straight amino acids, it's pretty rough.
okay? Just general curiosity. Do they make like registered dietitians go through and like taste test all of these things?
Sometimes. Now, it's funny because we used to have to taste test in our meetings at Palmetto Richland. Well, a new product would come in and they'd pass it around, but you always have those who are going to refuse because they're like, "Oh, that's terrible. I'm not tasting that." So I always think it's a good idea because I don't want somebody to have to take something I don't have to take. But man, I'm going to tell you, some of these things are pretty rough.
Okay, well, okay, because that when I was in grad school and they were doing like the FEES exam, like where they do the flexible endoscopy to like see the swallow, I was like, nope, try it on me because I want to know if I have to refer this out to a patient. I want to know.
Yes.
Horrible
Yes.
decision. Deviate. That was he whipped that thing out, and I was like, squirt, squirt, all the blood.
Oh
But
yeah,
yes,
That stuff is not pleasant, but I do think it makes you a better practitioner if you can empathize with people. So I think it's good to know what they're going to go through, and so I try to taste things when I can because I want to at least have an idea of what are they having to deal with.
what are we doing to the babies? Okay, all
Right.
right. So, all right. So for my kiddos from clinical perspective, when I go in and I do my eval, and normally SLPs are in there before you guys get there. Like
Yeah.
that's how it works. So
Yeah.
I go in and I do my eval, and I got a 6-week-old whose mother's been attempting to breastfeed. They're struggling to latch, but the 6-week-old has head to toe eczema. That for me is a red flag for food allergies.
Yes.
When I see especially, I mean, 6-week-olds should not have eczema. I mean, baby, we're not supposed to have eczema.
Right.
And when I see that we have a lot of emesis or we're spitting up, and I'm not talking like it's a tiny burp and we dribble. I'm talking
Right. Like
like
projectile. Yeah.
yeah. And typically when I do my PMH, my past medical history, and I get the diagnosis of FTT or failure to thrive, it's 9 times out of 10, it's either there's a GI issue or there's
Mhm.
an allergy issue. And then I
Mhm.
ask the question, how many formulas have you tried? And they
Right.
give like, they've tried 3 different formulas. They've tried breast, say it's a 4-month-old, and every month they've been on a new formula.
Right.
My first thought is we got to get an RD,
Yes.
make a referral,
Yes.
build a bridge.
Absolutely.
But a lot of times pediatricians will just send families home with various samples
Yep, and just tell them go experiment and let me know how it goes. And
Okay.
it's a train wreck.
Yes, exactly. So I don't want to cause offense with pediatricians because let's be honest, that's our referral source. They're
Right.
the gatekeepers of getting patients to us, especially when you're in the private practice world. But
Sure.
how would you recommend that SLPs or OTs, because there's some amazing peds OTs that get called in
Yep.
for feeding as well because we have an overlap in scope of practice. How do you recommend that we teach our families to advocate to get the referral to you so that you guys can do your more than calculator magic?
Yeah, that's an awesome question. And I don't know if there's a perfect answer to it, but because it does depend on the pediatrician. And some of them are great about this, and some of them are not so much. But I always encourage families to say, just to tell them, look, we're confused. We need more expertise. We need someone to help walk us through the process. We're really kind of, scratching our heads about what to do about this, and we need someone to help guide us through the process. And as a SLP, you guys can say the same of, look, I'm trying to work with this child, but there's a lot of red flags that we are seeing on the nutrition assimilation side. We really need some expertise and somebody who can come in and evaluate what's going on, and help these parents navigate these formulas and figure out which one's the best. And just say, look, can we get a referral to a dietitian, because that is what needs to happen. That part of our job is to know those formulas and be able to understand how to navigate them, and to be able to look at the picture and figure out, okay, what have they been on, and what has and hasn't worked, and then make an actual informed decision on where to go next. Because one of the things that happens, and this is what gets overlooked a lot by parents, pediatricians, and a lot of people, is when you send them on a bunch of samples and then they try something for 3 days and they're like, oh, this is terrible. This isn't working. He's still spitting up and throwing up and all this kind of stuff. They switch to a new one and then they have the same issue. And the problem is the baby goes through this horrible GI whirlwind of introducing all these different formulas. And one of them might actually be fine if they would allow the system to calm down, but they never get a chance to actually calm down enough to be able to use a formula. And so they just can end up being in this vicious cycle, and they can't find one that works, because they haven't gone about it the right way. And that's part of what really gets overlooked and sends people in kind of this spiral, and the continued failure to thrive, and all the other problems.
Okay. So is there a timeline that we can like encourage families to stick it out while we're trying to get them to you?
I usually there sort of is. What I usually tell people is to give it about a week. You need more than 3 days. You need
Okay.
about a week. But that's also a little bit frustrating in that a lot of times they get sent on things they shouldn't have gotten sent home on, and so they're trying to use something that's not going to work. And so it's a little bit of a catch-22. Like, we kind of need to be in there ASAP, and the
Yeah.
doctors really should be referring them out at the beginning of that process. And so a lot of it is unfortunately just trying to play catch up, for both of us, in that we've just tried to get in there when we can and help them navigate these things, because it can really send them in a bad spiral if they kind of keep bouncing around from one thing to another. And basically, I would say, I usually tell people, whichever is causing the least amount of issues, try to stick with it for at least a week until we can figure out what's going on. Or that's also a point where I would literally be willing to talk to a family by phone for 10 minutes and figure out, just off the top, okay, what's the big issue? What are you doing? And then tell them, okay, go buy this and try this, and then let's talk in a week. Because to me, time is of the essence in a situation like that.
Okay. All right. Now, I have always been under the and correct me if this is a misunderstanding, that Nutramagem and Almentum also, can we all agree that an Almentum baby, you can smell those babies before you see them? Um, I have always thought that those two formulas were specific for food allergens. I didn't know that those were that help me out here, hydrogized.
Hydrolyzed, yes, they're peptide based. Yeah,
Okay.
so they are for food allergies, and we use those as a first step. And essentially, interestingly enough, a lot of times, like a baby who has a dairy allergy, for example, can be on Alimentum or Nutramigen and still tolerate it, even though those formulas are dairy based. And so, by breaking it down into a peptide base, a lot of times you will eliminate the allergic reaction that they were having because they're not dealing with the whole protein, they're dealing with a piece of it. and
Okay.
and so a lot of times that does work. It just doesn't always work, and sometimes they're still struggling, still not getting resolution of their symptoms and really need to go to an elemental, and they just don't always get there when they need it. Or it's sometimes it gets real gray because I think that doctors are just as confused, and they're not really sure what to recommend in certain cases either.
Okay. All right. So we have three main protein types: the intact, the
Hmm.
peptide, and then the elementum or
Hmm.
elemental. And then how does the body absorb or break down those different foods? How are they utilized in the body?
Yeah, so so your intact protein, your pretty much all your proteins start their digestive process in the stomach. The stomach is actually what's designed to break down proteins. Now, if you think about that, that actually affects what you're going to give. So, for example, if I have a baby with a J tube and we're feeding a J tube, I don't want to give them an intact formula because we've already bypassed the stomach. And so, what is going to break the protein down? There's no acid there. In the small intestine, the acid isn't there. And so, an intact protein is ideally broken down to peptides by the time it leaves the stomach. And
Okay.
so, it's there to help to, it's there. The stomach is there to break proteins down, and then it passes it off to the small intestine, where those peptides are further moved along the duodenum and into the jejunum, and then finally the ileum, where further protein breakdown happens along the way. Most of the protein is finished broken down by the jejunal part, and then the ileum basically is absorbing water and nutrients from that point forward. Your others, your peptide base and elemental, basically just shorten that process. So they allow you to bypass the first step of acid digestion that usually happens in the stomach and get straight to the process of breaking those peptides down to get them across the brush border of the intestine into the bloodstream where they can be used, or in the case of elemental, just transport. There's no breakdown that needs to happen. It's just literally straight in like a sponge, soak it up, and go into the tissue. And so those are essentially different steps along the same route. It is, each one is a further step along the same route for the protein digestion. As far as the rest of it, the carbohydrate side, for example, that is somewhat similar across all the formulas, even though there are differences in, for example, the types of carbohydrates that are designed for easier gut digestion to help prevent colic and bloating and that sort of thing. So you'll see stuff like galacto and oligosaccharides. You'll see stuff that's maltodextrin based or pure sugar based or whatever, and that is based on how well, or how they're trying to allow the carbohydrate to be broken down and digested. And fats basically are the same across the board for most all formulas. There are some differences, but fats don't typically cause an issue unless there's a metabolic problem, and then we use specialty formulas for that.
Okay.
So that's kind of the quick and dirty, and then your nutrients pretty much are absorbed the same in all of them.
Okay. All right. So, all right. Now I have so many questions. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So all right. From my perspective, when I want to go in and I want to do PO trials, a lot of the kiddos that I have that are on these formulas and they get them, and again, we're going to come back and talk about feeding tubes. So I don't want to go down that route, but like even when they're on like a Pediasure bottle or a
Mhm.
Pediasure sippy cup, I mean, they may take 8 ounces of that, and then I'm supposed to go in and do my best attempt at like some PO trials to build them up to wanting table food or pureed food or
Mhm.
whatever they're, and what I have found is that my kiddos that are on a lot of those formulas, they're not pooping.
Oh yeah.
They're constipated. they're irritable, and they're uncomfortable. So, and they're always full. Those formulas make them full. And then I am set for failure from a peds dysphagia, peds feeding perspective, because I I can't get anything in upstream because downstream hasn't cleaned out, moved out.
Yeah.
So, and when I try to call, and this is, I had this conversation on Monday and on Tuesday this week with the same pediatrician's office. They're like, Pediasure doesn't, these formulas, they don't cause constipation. You're misunderstanding. And I'm like, really? Because I'm pretty sure that it might. So,
Yeah.
on behalf of all feeding therapists across the nation, help.
Yeah. Man, I wish there was an easy answer to this one. It's kind of a combination problem.
Okay.
It starts out with the fact that a lot of times they are avoiding food. So they're trying to take in a liquid diet from a liquid that is a milk-based product. So that's a problem from the get-go. And so number one, milk is constipating. Okay, so milk and cheese, dairy is constipating.
But it's so good with wine.
No, it is. It's great. Which, hey, if you're not overeating it, it's never going to cause a problem. And the problem is the balance. The problem is the proportion and balance. So, in a lot of kids, the Pediasure is making up the bulk of these feeding kiddos meals, and so that's kind of what's in their system. There's not a whole lot else in there. And so when that's the case, you have so much milk protein, you're going to have constipation without question. Okay, and so that's number one. Number two is because they're not eating food, they're not getting fiber. Now, you can get Pediasure with fiber, but that's not the one that's prescribed ordinarily. But even the Pediasure with fiber, in my opinion, isn't going to be enough to make up the difference. And so, what they need in their diet are some sources of fiber. And then the third problem, a lot of times, is hydration. So they're not drinking enough water, which means their stool is too hard and they're not able to move things through. And then the fourth problem on top of all of that is that it's not just a constipation thing, it's a satisfaction thing, in that the Pediasure is very satiating. It fills you up because of the blend of stuff. It's a complete meal, quote unquote, and it's high in sugar. And so
Yes,
kids,
that's like the first or second ingredient is
yeah,
sugar. I
and
mean,
so
I
it's
don't
so
know.
sweet. Yeah, it's like crack. And so it's so sweet. These kids are like, "Ooh, yum, let me get a Pediasure. I don't want my food. I'm just going to drink the Pediasure." And they
Yes.
get stuck on the Pediasure and then they won't eat. And that is a problem I go round and round and round with parents about. And ultimately that boils down to how how attentive and desperate parents want to be, because some of them are just desperate to get their kids to eat, and they're like, if she'll drink it, drink it. Don't worry about it. But my philosophy is always, you make them have food first, and then if there is still a shortage of food, you give this as a follow-up. But a lot of people do it as a first. They just pop the Pediasure, sit it on the table, say drink up, and then the kid skips their food, and then you come in and they don't want your food either, and then you're kind of in this bad cycle.
Yes, that's my world. Okay, and what that satiation feeling,
Yes.
that is probably the bane of my existence, because um it's like feeding tube dependency without a feeding tube. Because
It
the
is, and I'll tell you, this is a tragedy. Like I there's so many pieces of this puzzle. I can't give a one good fix, but I know for a fact that I've never seen in the history of mankind so many kids on reflux medications in my life. Like,
Yes.
it's epidemic. It's absolutely epidemic. Okay, kids. I mean, literally, it seems like to me about 1 in 3, maybe 1 in 4
Mhm.
kids seem to be on reflux
Yep.
meds. Okay, that's a problem. Number one, you should not have reflux as a child. Okay, and then what happens is, then of course there are kids who need it, who have like all the regurgitation, all this kind of stuff. But the issue that a lot of people overlook with reflux medications is, what is the thing? What do they do? What they do
Cause
is they
constipation.
well, it can as a side effect, but what it does is actually kills your stomach acid production. And when it kills your stomach acid production, you have slow gastric emptying,
Mhm.
slow motility. And slow motility means you stay full forever. And so
Mhm.
you just have this cyclical issue, because very possibly, at least part of the reflux was caused by bacterial imbalance and constipation down the line. That really never gets addressed. We just kind of throw them reflux medication on top to keep them from regurgitating and causing issues in their esophagus. And you're fighting a battle at that point because you're trying to get their gut to move when it doesn't want to move. You're trying to get them to eat when they don't want to eat. But if you stop the reflux medication, you're in another pickle. And so it ends up being a balance that a lot of healthcare teams don't ever try to fight because they don't want to deal with the bigger picture that you have to deal with to do that.
Okay. So what is your opinion on probiotics? Because I get asked that a lot, and my default is, um, that's outside of my scope of practice. You need to speak with your RD
Mhm.
and your pediatrician. And then they say, well, what do you do as a mom? And as a mom, we do it because,
Right.
and we change them and we offer varieties because this particular mom doesn't sleep very often. And when I don't sleep, I wake up in the middle of the night
Right.
and I do research because I'm totally nuts. And
Sound like
my limited research is you change up your probiotics. That way you have a variance of extra gut microbes being presented. So
sure.
lay that on us.
So yeah, so opinion with that is that it's also a little more complex in that yes, probiotics are awesome. Everybody needs them. We should all get them. I'm drinking some right now. This is kombucha, um, and and you need them in your diet. But we tend to try to oversimplify as Americans. We want to say, okay, let's just pop the probiotic. But what reality is, you should be eating fermented foods. That's just the bottom line. So yogurt and kefir and kombucha and sauerkraut and all these things. Now, getting kids to eat
Kimchi.
yeah, kimchi. Now, getting kids to eat sauerkraut and kimchi is probably not going to happen, but the yogurt and kefir is a little more possible. But
Is
here's
that
the
how you say that word? I've been calling them kefirs.
I bet I call it kefir too. It's that's a toss up. It depends on whether you're in the Middle East, I guess. I'm not sure.
That boils down to, do you pronounce it dysphagia or dysphagia? And it really depends on how old you are and where you went to school. So okay,
Exactly.
I
Yeah,
got
I think kefir is if you're in the South, it's kefir, and then if you're outside in the rest of the world, it might be kefir, but I'm not sure.
leave
So
it to us Southerners to butcher all pronunciation. I
right,
promise.
right. We can butcher anything.
Yeah.
So um, so ultimately, it's a little more complex, and here's why. Everybody needs the good balance of bacteria. Yes, you need a variety, and that's true too. So if you're taking supplements, it's good to rotate around. But there's a lot of kids who, if their parents are asking about a probiotic, they've already got significant GI problems,
Okay.
and so for a significant number of those kids you add probiotics and some of them are going to help them and some of them are going to make them feel a lot worse and they may have an increase in symptoms like colic and gassiness and fussiness and all this sort of thing purely because their bacterial balance is out of whack and a lot of your probiotics also have prebiotics and those prebiotics feed both good and bad bacteria and so you could add a probiotic in and then they feel worse and they act worse and you're like what in the heck's going on, I don't understand this. And this happens a ton with my autistic kids. I've worked with an autistic child at one point for over 9 months. And the entire 9 months, we were trying a lot of different probiotics to try to find one that worked. And I was doing a lot of specialized ones that are purely for autistic kids. Never found one that worked. Every time we tried it, significant behavior change, way worse issues with GI, colic, all this sort of stuff. And so the long and short of it is if a child has purely digestive problems, a lot of times a probiotic will improve that. But it also depends on the probiotic. But then if there's neurological things in play, mood and behavioral stuff, you have to be careful. And so when I talk to parents about it, I have to get a little more of a history on them before I can recommend what direction to go with those.
Have you just geeking extra geeky? Have you read the research articles that came out of University of Arizona and the Ohio State? It was ASU a couple years ago about fecal matter transplant
Oh
for
yeah.
individuals. Yeah. Have you seen it? I haven't seen any follow-up studies, but all right,
Well,
so
there's actually, I don't know if they're doing any follow-up studies, but there's actually a ton of studying going on in this area. And what we know for a fact is that fecal matter transplants really help with uh, Crohn's, colitis, and a lot
diverticulitis.
of times IBS.
Mhm. Yeah.
And we're a little more iffy on whether it helps with things like small intestinal bacterial overgrowth or leaky gut issues or things like that, simply because those happen a little higher up in the intestine. And, it's a question as to how far it goes. But in a scenario where they're not responding to other treatments, honestly, a lot of times it works miraculously,
All
because
right.
you're basically replacing the microbiome in one person with stuff from a healthy person, and the healthy person's bacteria overwhelm the bad bacteria and push it out.
Okay.
It's
So
pretty fascinating stuff.
when I first read it, it like blew my, all right, folks, in case you haven't read the article, Google it, OSU, ASU. It's,
Quite
I mean,
interesting.
they're powerhouses in the field of research. And what they did was they did a study, like 8 years ago? I'm
Yeah,
old.
probably. Yeah.
It was like 8 or 9 years ago, where they took a series of children that were had autism spectrum disorders, and they took healthy gut microbes, and they were chasing gut. They weren't chasing language. They were chasing healing, working on the gut.
Right.
And they gave them healthy gut microbes. I think it was a capsule or an NG tube, and they put them in, and inside of what, like 6 weeks, they had anywhere from 6 months to 2 years worth of language development.
Hmm.
And as a byproduct,
Hmm. Yeah.
it was unbelievable. I always
Yeah.
say what we don't know about the brain, mouth, and gut, but folks, what we don't know about the brain, mouth, and gut. But I'm curious, the SLP, the language portion of me wants to know, how long did those effects stay? Because if we're
Mm-hmm.
changing the flora and the fauna like that, will
Is it permanent, or does it? Yeah. Does it go
yeah.
back? Yeah.
And
Yeah.
do they have to go back and do like recurrent, or once they get to, so this is how it works in Michelle Land, and answer this riddle. So like we have, I take it as your gut is the base of your house. This is your foundation.
Hmm.
And then we have to have proper core strength. So those are like our pillars. Those are our, our post in the house. And you can't, if your gut is unhealthy, then the foundation is weak. If you have built your house with poor pillars, your core strength, you can't sit up to move, you have limited mobility,
Hmm.
you can't get up and crawl, then that's going to negatively impact your GI motility. You're not going to be able to poop because you
Right.
can't get up and move.
Sure.
And then you add in your electrical wiring could be all hosed, and that's the enteric nerve system of your stomach. And if we have
Hmm.
severe acid reflux, like
Right.
that.
The vasovagal reactions and all.
Yes, yes. But if we start here, if we start with working on making sure the gut is healthy, and a lot of that has to do with, like you said, finding the right balance in the formulas, and where are
Hmm.
we with our, pre and probiotics. And then we're working collaboratively to make sure our core strength with the OTs and the PTs is right. I mean,
Right.
it's beautiful. You could build a McMansion.
Agreed. Yes, and
Yeah.
if we start using good building blocks, that would happen. And I think that's the key, is getting to the point where these kids are actually getting fed really good food. And that's a whole nother topic, because there are lots of stories about families who switch from quote unquote commercialized formulas over to either a blenderized home formula, or something like, now there's a
Nourish.
food-based blenderized
Nourish.
formula called Liquid Hope and Nourish. Yeah, both of those that are basically demonstrating the benefit of whole foods,
Okay.
and how your body likes them more. So this
I have,
this really gives us, what you put in there really does make a difference in how you're going to react.
okay. So here's my question. When I was in, hang with me, I was in Kansas City a couple weeks ago,
Hmm.
And there was, oh my gosh, you would have loved her. There was this registered dietitian in the room. She was sassy. She had fun, bright hair, but she was just like
Nice.
on it. And
Sure.
she said, she's a huge fan, was a huge fan of like the organic, plant-based, actual blended food, like Nourish, Liquid Hope, those kind of things. But what she found was that when her kids had been on it for a year, and that was the only thing that they had taken for that entire year, that they weren't trying other foods,
Yeah.
that the gut had compensated back to being constipated,
Hmm.
and that
Interesting.
and she had a couple that had, when that's the only thing that they're exposed to
Sure.
5, 6 times a day for a year,
Yep.
the gut
Yep.
needs the diversity. And so she's
That's
like,
great.
I like to use that with a blenderized diet of
Yeah.
actual foods. That's what she said she recommended for her patients.
Yeah, I would agree. I would agree with that because much like your body needs muscle confusion in a physical workout, your gut needs exposure to diversity because two things would happen. One, it compensates and then it quits tolerating and taking in as much nutrients from those foods. And two, you can actually create intolerances if you're exposed to the same thing over and over and over and over too much with no rotational break. And so I'm a huge fan of diversity in your food, which I think is the reason why God made foods to grow in different seasons, because you've got
Oh my
different
God, that's
foods,
brilliant.
different foods in different seasons, and so you have a
Yes.
different diet depending on the season, and so your body's made to go through a constant cycle of change and rotation, and if that doesn't happen, then you get dependent on things. And even, for example, even timing of food. We know from studies way back in the 50s when they established the RDAs for nutrients that if you feed, like, let's say, vitamin C every single day, 500 milligrams every single day, the body actually down regulates how much it'll take from that vitamin C. It'll actually cut down by like half what it's absorbing. But then if you take it away for like 2 days, 3 days, add it back in, it's already upregulated again. And so by rotating through foods, you actually absorb them more efficiently rather than feeding the same thing every single day because the body says, oh, well, I'm already getting this X amount. So I'm going to cut back how much I'm absorbing because I don't want to absorb too much. And then it creates this bad process of poor digestion and absorption that isn't being interrupted by breaks.
Okay. Hmm. You just blew my mind on the seasonal food difference. So I'm still
Yeah,
processing
it's pretty,
that.
it's
Like,
pretty cool, isn't it?
I'm like, I'm pretty sure I'm going to sign up for the summer CSA at the local organic farm now. So thank
Yes,
you.
yes. I'm glad you reminded me. That's been on my mind, and we've been getting a couple of things from a local stand, but I need to go ahead and jump in.
Yeah, I'm like, okay, I got that email this morning. So folks, check out your local CSAs. Woo!
That's right.
Okay. All right. So then I have one quick question to wrap this up before we break for opening to questions. What how do you normally pick which formula to put these kids on?
That is a great question. That is the $1 million question. But that's basically where the clinical judgment comes in. So I am looking at a lot of different factors, but it boils down to first off, checking out where is their digestive function. Do they have the ability to take in intact proteins or not? Do they have intolerances, food allergies? What is their gut condition like? So, okay, are they feeding in a PEG or a G tube, or are they feeding through a J tube? So then that's going to change what I recommend because of the protein digestion aspect of it. And then beyond that, I'm also going to look at, okay, what rate, which we can get into this next time when we talk about rates, but what rate can they tolerate? So some kids can only tolerate small volumes, which means I've got to give them a higher concentrated amount of food to get it into their system. So then that's going to dictate whether I do, for example, say a Peptamen versus a Peptamen 1.5, because the 1.5 is 50% more calories. So those things come into play. And then finally, I'm going to look at their overall broad health picture of what's their goals, what's their neurological function, what's their physical function. Are they failure to thrive, or are they overweight, normal weight? Do they have behavioral issues so that I'm not wanting to feed dyes and tons of sugar and stuff like that? Just looking at that kind of picture. And when I put all that together, magical potion, I come out with, basically some guidelines of, okay, let's try this, see how this works. And then there's always tweaking. Sometimes you get it right the first time. Sometimes you don't. You need to go back and try a second or third thing to just figure out what they're going to work with.
Okay. Beautiful. Okay. All right. Well, I just looked at the clock and we are going to have like a super short Q&A time because we like way surpassed our like 45 minutes timeline. But I told you I was wicked excited about this topic.
It's awesome.
One more time, if people have pertinent case questions that they can't get their answers answered in, your website and your Facebook. Can you lay that out?
Yeah,
one last
website is www.pathoflifenutrition.com, and Facebook is Facebook.com/Path of Life Nutrition. And then you can reach me by email from either of those places, and I'd love to talk with you guys.
That's a wrap, folks. Once again, thank you for listening to First Bite, fed, fun, and functional. I'm your humble but yet sassy host, Michelle Dawson, the All Things Peds SLP. This podcast is part of a course offered for continuing education through SpeechTherapyPD.com. Please check out the website if you'd like to learn more about CEU opportunities for this episode, as well as the ones that are archived. And, as always, remember, feed your mind, feed your soul, be kind, and feed those babies.